the world of elite military operations, respect isn't just earned through rank or position. It flows from something deeper, something that can't be bought with bars on a collar or years of service. Sometimes it takes just one moment, one terrible decision, to reveal who truly commands respect and who merely wears the uniform. This is the story of Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a man who believed his position gave him the right to humiliate others. It's about Petty Officer Sarah Chen, a dedicated sailor who never expected to become the center of a moment that would be whispered about in military circles for years to come. And it's about a brotherhood so fierce, so unwavering, that when one of their own was wronged, their silent response spoke louder than any words ever could. What happened in that mess hall on a Tuesday evening in 2019 at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado would teach everyone present a lesson about true leadership, genuine respect, and the unbreakable bonds that exist among those who serve at the highest levels of military excellence. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Lieutenant Webb was about to get an education he would never forget. Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Chen had always believed that hard work and dedication would be enough to earn her place in the Navy. At 26, she had already proven herself countless times over during her 8 years of service. Her personnel file read like a testament to excellence. Commendations for outstanding performance, certifications that took most sailors years to achieve, and the kind of spotless record that made senior officers take notice. Sarah worked as a logistics coordinator at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, the home of Naval Special Warfare Command, and the famous Navy SEALs. Her job was complex and demanding, requiring her to coordinate equipment, supplies, and personnel movements for some of the most classified operations in the military. She took pride in her work, knowing that the men and women who depended on her logistics support were often heading into situations where a missing piece of equipment could mean the difference between life and death. The base was a world unto itself, a place where the ordinary rules of military hierarchy sometimes bent under the weight of operational necessity and mutual respect earned through shared hardship. Sarah had learned to navigate this environment carefully. She was one of the few women in her role, and she understood that she had to be twice as good as her male counterparts to receive half the recognition. She had made peace with this reality and focused on doing her job with the kind of precision and reliability that made her indispensable. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had arrived at Coronado 6 months earlier with all the swagger and confidence that came with his recent promotion. At 28, he was younger than Sarah but outranked her significantly. Webb had graduated from the Naval Academy with decent grades and had served adequately during his first tour aboard a destroyer. His transfer to Coronado was supposed to be a stepping stone to bigger things, a chance to work with elite units and add some impressive entries to his resume. From the beginning, Webb seemed to carry himself with the kind of arrogance that made seasoned enlisted personnel exchange knowing glances. He was quick to remind people of his rank, slower to listen to advice from those with more experience, and had a particular talent for making those beneath him in the chain of command feel small. Sarah had encountered officers like Webb before, and she had learned that the best strategy was to keep her head down, do her job perfectly, and wait for them to either learn humility or transfer elsewhere. The evening of November 12, 2019, started like any other. Sarah had worked a 12-hour shift coordinating a particularly complex equipment movement for an upcoming SEAL team deployment. The operation required precision timing and flawless execution, and Sarah had spent the day double-checking manifests, confirming transportation schedules, and ensuring that every piece of gear would be exactly where it needed to be when the teams needed it. She was exhausted but satisfied with the day's work when she finally made her way to the mess hall for dinner. The facility was busier than usual, filled with sailors, SEALs, and support personnel grabbing late meals between training exercises and operational briefings. Sarah took her place in line, looking forward to a hot meal, and maybe a few minutes of quiet conversation with colleagues she had come to consider friends. The mess hall at Coronado was different from those at other bases. The presence of so many elite operators created an atmosphere of quiet professionalism. Conversations were often conducted in hushed tones, not because of any formal requirement, but out of respect for the sensitive nature of much of the work being done on base. Rank still mattered, but it mattered less than competence, reliability, and the kind of mutual respect that developed between people who understood the stakes of their work. Sarah had just collected her tray and was looking for a place to sit when she noticed Lieutenant Webb standing near the beverage station. He was talking loudly with another junior officer, his voice carrying across the dining area, in a way that seemed calculated to draw attention. Sarah tried to avoid eye contact as she passed, hoping to find a quiet corner where she could eat in peace. Webb had been drinking. Not heavily, but enough that his usual arrogance was amplified and his judgment was clearly impaired. He had spent the evening at the officers' club with several other junior officers, regaling them with stories of his academy days and his plans for rapid advancement through the ranks. When the group had decided to grab a late dinner, Webb had seen it as another opportunity to hold court and demonstrate his authority. As Sarah passed by, Webb's conversation with his companion suddenly stopped. She felt his eyes on her and tried to quicken her pace, but Webb's voice cut through the ambient noise of the mess hall. Well, Webb said, his words slightly slurred but clearly audible to everyone within 20 feet. If it isn't our little logistics queen, tell me, Chen, did you manage to count all the bullets correctly today, or should we expect another one of your famous screw-ups? Sarah stopped walking. The comment was unfair and inaccurate. She had never made a significant error in her logistics work, and Webb knew it. His reference to screw-ups was based on nothing more than his apparent need to diminish her in front of others. She turned to face him, her training and professionalism warring with her natural human response to such public humiliation. Sir, I completed all assigned tasks according to protocol, she replied quietly, hoping to end the interaction quickly and professionally. Webb's companion, Lieutenant Junior Grade Mike Foster, looked uncomfortable. Foster had worked with Sarah before and knew her reputation for excellence. He could see that Webb was out of line, but he also understood the delicate nature of challenging a superior officer's behavior, especially in public. Webb, however, was just getting started. He stepped closer to Sarah, his voice growing louder and more mocking. According to protocol, he repeated in a sing-song voice. That's all you people ever say, isn't it? Follow protocol. Do as you're told. Don't think too much about anything important. The conversation in the immediate area began to die down as people noticed the confrontation developing. Sarah could feel the eyes of dozens of personnel turning toward them, and she fought to keep her expression neutral. She understood that anything she said or did now would be remembered and discussed. Her response would either reinforce Webb's narrative of her as a subordinate who needed to be kept in line, or it would demonstrate the kind of grace under pressure that had earned her the respect of so many of her colleagues. Sir, if you have concerns about my performance, I would prefer to discuss them through the proper channels, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Webb laughed, a harsh sound that carried clearly through the now quiet mess hall. Proper channels, he repeated mockingly. You know what your problem is, Chen? You think you're special because you work with the big boys. You think that just because some SEALs pat you on the head and tell you what a good job you're doing, that makes you important. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Webb's words were designed to cut deep, and they succeeded. She had worked hard to earn the respect of the special operations personnel she supported, and that respect meant everything to her. To have it dismissed so casually, so cruelly, felt like a physical blow. Around them, the mess hall had grown increasingly quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Among those watching were several Navy SEALs who had worked directly with Sarah and knew firsthand the quality of her work and the dedication she brought to her job. Chief Petty Officer Jake Martinez had been having dinner with 3 other SEALs when the confrontation began. Martinez had worked with Sarah on dozens of operations over the past 2 years and had come to regard her as one of the most reliable and competent logistics coordinators he had ever worked with. He watched Webb's performance with growing disgust, recognizing the behavior of a weak leader trying to build himself up by tearing others down. Sitting at a nearby table, Senior Chief Tom Williams felt his jaw tighten as he listened to Webb's verbal assault. Williams had served for 20 years and had seen officers like Webb before. They were usually the ones who had never faced real adversity, never had their leadership truly tested, and who compensated for their insecurities by bullying those they perceived as vulnerable. Webb seemed to interpret Sarah's silence as weakness, and he pressed his advantage. Maybe you need a reminder about who's really in charge here, he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Maybe you've forgotten what it means to show proper respect to your superiors. Sarah's hands clenched slightly at her sides, but she maintained her composure. Sir, I've always shown appropriate respect to all officers, she replied, her voice remaining level despite the provocation. Have you? Webb asked, stepping even closer. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you think you're too good to acknowledge when an officer is trying to give you some helpful guidance. The absurdity of calling his public humiliation helpful guidance was lost on no one in the mess hall. Webb's behavior was so far outside the bounds of professional conduct that even junior personnel could see it for what it was. The abuse of power by someone who had never learned the difference between authority and leadership. Lieutenant Foster finally found the courage to intervene, albeit weakly. Marcus, maybe we should. What? Webb snapped, whirling on his companion. Maybe we should let the enlisted personnel forget their place. Maybe we should pretend that rank doesn't matter. Foster fell silent, unwilling to push further. His silence left Sarah standing alone in front of an increasingly hostile Webb, with dozens of witnesses watching to see how the confrontation would resolve. Webb turned back to Sarah, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. You know what I think, Chen? I think you need to learn some humility. I think you need to remember that no matter how much the Special Operations boys might like your work, you're still just another enlisted sailor who needs to remember her place. Sarah's composure finally cracked slightly. I know exactly what my place is, sir, she said, her voice carrying just a hint of steel. I've earned my place through 8 years of faithful service and a record that speaks for itself. It was a mild response, barely defensive, and entirely appropriate. But to Webb, who was looking for any excuse to escalate the situation, it represented unacceptable insubordination. Did you just talk back to me? He asked, his voice rising dangerously. Did you just question my assessment of your service? The mess hall was now completely silent except for Webb's voice. Every conversation had stopped, every movement had ceased. The tension in the room was palpable, as everyone waited to see how far Webb would push the confrontation. Sarah realized she was trapped. Anything she said would be interpreted as further insubordination, but remaining silent would be seen as an admission of guilt. Webb had created a no-win situation, and she understood that his goal was not to correct any behavioral problem, but simply to humiliate her in front of as many people as possible. Sir, I was simply clarifying my understanding of the situation, she said carefully, trying to find words that would diffuse the confrontation without giving Webb additional ammunition. But Webb was beyond reason now, drunk on his own power and the attention he was receiving. The mess hall full of witnesses wasn't a deterrent to him. It was an audience for his demonstration of authority. Clarifying your understanding? He repeated mockingly. Let me clarify something for you, petty officer. You are a subordinate. You do what you're told, when you're told, without question or commentary. And when a superior officer offers you guidance, you say yes, sir, and thank you, sir, and you keep your mouth shut. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. She understood that this moment would define not just how Webb saw her, but how every person present would remember her. Her response would either validate Webb's treatment of her or demonstrate that she possessed the kind of character that deserved respect regardless of rank. She straightened her shoulders slightly and looked Webb directly in the eye. Yes, sir, she said simply. But her tone and bearing made it clear that her compliance was a matter of military discipline, not personal submission. She wasn't acknowledging the legitimacy of Webb's behavior. She was demonstrating her own professionalism in the face of his complete lack thereof. Webb heard the subtext in her response and realized that despite his best efforts to humiliate her, Sarah had somehow managed to maintain her dignity. His frustration boiled over, and he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation here, petty officer, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I think you need a more direct lesson in respect and military bearing. What happened next would be replayed in the minds of everyone present for years to come, discussed in hushed conversations throughout the Naval Special Operations community, and ultimately serve as a defining moment in understanding the difference between true leadership and the mere exercise of power. The slap echoed through the mess hall like a gunshot. Webb's hand moved so quickly that most witnesses didn't see it coming. One moment he was standing inches from Sarah's face, his words dripping with contempt, and the next his open palm connected with her cheek in a sharp, resounding crack that seemed to freeze time itself. Sarah's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. Her hand instinctively rose to her face, covering the red mark that was already beginning to form on her cheek. For a moment she stood there in absolute shock, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. In 8 years of military service, through countless difficult situations and challenging superiors, no one had ever laid a hand on her. Webb stood there for a heartbeat, his hand still raised, a look of satisfaction crossing his features as he watched Sarah's stunned reaction. Then he began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, low and mean, but grew louder as he seemed to feed off what he perceived as his complete domination of the situation. There, he said between laughs, his voice carrying clearly through the dead silence of the mess hall. Now maybe you'll remember what respect looks like. Maybe next time an officer gives you guidance, you'll think twice before running your mouth. His laughter grew louder, more theatrical, as if he were performing for the dozens of witnesses surrounding them. Webb seemed completely unaware that the atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically, He was so focused on his moment of perceived triumph that he failed to notice the change in the faces around him. Sarah slowly lowered her hand from her cheek, her eyes never leaving Webb's face. The physical pain from the slap was nothing compared to the humiliation of being struck in front of so many colleagues. But something else was building inside her now. Something that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the profound injustice of what had just occurred. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed protocol, maintained her professionalism, and shown appropriate respect throughout the entire encounter. Webb had escalated the situation at every turn, ignoring multiple opportunities to end the confrontation professionally, and now he had crossed a line that should never be crossed, regardless of rank or circumstance. But Sarah was a professional sailor, trained in military discipline and the chain of command. Even in this moment of profound injustice, her training held. She would not strike back, would not escalate to physical confrontation, would not give Webb or anyone else reason to question her military bearing. Instead, she came to attention, her posture perfect despite the circumstances. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I request permission to speak with the Master Chief about this incident." Webb's laughter died abruptly. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that his actions might have consequences. The mention of the Master Chief, the senior enlisted advisor for the base, suddenly made the situation real in a way that it hadn't been before. "You'll speak to whoever I tell you to speak to," he snapped, his temporary moment of doubt quickly replaced by renewed arrogance. "And right now I'm telling you to go sit down, eat your dinner, and think about what you learned here tonight."
But Sarah didn't move.
She remained at attention, her gaze fixed on a point just over Webb's shoulder, her request hanging in the air between them. It was a masterful response, perfectly within regulations while simultaneously making it clear that she would not simply accept his abuse and move on. Webb realized that he was losing control of the situation. Sarah's refusal to cower or slink away was undermining the narrative he had tried to create.
"How did Tail get?"
Worse, her professional bearing in the face of his unprofessional behavior was making him look worse by comparison. "I said sit down," he repeated, his voice rising dangerously. "That's a direct order, petty officer." "With respect, sir," Sarah replied, her voice remaining calm. "I believe I have the right to report this incident through proper channels." The word report seemed to hit Webb like a physical blow. His face flushed deeper red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The idea that his behavior might become the subject of an official report, might be reviewed by senior officers, might affect his career prospects, clearly hadn't occurred to him until this moment. "You'll report nothing," he snarled, stepping closer to her again. "You brought this on yourself, with your insubordinate attitude. Any report you make will reflect poorly on you, not on me." But even as Webb spoke these words, he was beginning to realize that something had changed in the mess hall around them. The silence had deepened, becoming something almost oppressive. When he finally tore his attention away from Sarah and looked around the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Every single Navy SEAL in the mess hall was standing. They hadn't moved quickly or dramatically. There had been no scraping of chairs or sudden movements that might have drawn Webb's attention during his confrontation with Sarah. Instead, they had risen quietly, almost simultaneously, as if responding to some signal that only they could hear. Chief Petty Officer Jake Martinez stood beside his table, his plate pushed aside, his eyes fixed on Webb with an expression that could have cut through steel. Senior Chief Tom Williams had risen from his seat at the far end of the hall, his 22 years of experience and authority radiating from him like heat from a forge. At a table near the entrance, Petty Officer First Class David Kim stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest. Kim had worked directly with Sarah on a particularly challenging operation just 2 months earlier, and he remembered how she had worked 18-hour days to ensure that his team had everything they needed for a successful mission. Near the serving line, Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Santos had set down her coffee cup and stood with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of years of leadership and hard-won respect. Santos was one of the few female SEALs on base, and she understood better than most what Sarah was experiencing. One by one, Webb's eyes found them all. Senior Chief Marcus Johnson, whose teams had relied on Sarah's logistics coordination for operations that he couldn't even discuss with his own family. Petty Officer Second Class Alex Rivera, who had seen Sarah work through the night to fix a supply chain problem that could have compromised an entire mission. They stood in perfect silence. These elite warriors who had faced down terrorists and enemy combatants in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They weren't threatening Webb, weren't moving toward him or speaking. They were simply standing, bearing witness to what had occurred. their presence serving as a silent judgment of his actions. The psychological impact was overwhelming.
Webb found himself surrounded by men and women whose very presence commanded respect, whose reputation for excellence and professionalism made his own behavior look petty and small by comparison. These were the people that Sarah worked with, the people who depended on her expertise and reliability, the people who had seen firsthand the quality of her character and her work.
Other personnel in the mess hall began to notice the SEAL standing and started to understand what was happening. Some remained seated, uncertain about how to respond, while others quietly rose to their feet in solidarity.
The base's senior enlisted personnel, regardless of their specific roles, recognized the moment for what it was, a defining test of the values they all claimed to uphold. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Hayes had been having dinner in the senior enlisted section when the commotion began.
At 52, Hayes had served for 31 years and had seen every type of leadership failure imaginable. When he noticed the disturbance and began to make his way toward the confrontation, he found himself moving through a forest of standing personnel. Hayes had worked with Webb before and had already formed opinions about the young officer's character and leadership potential. He had also worked extensively with Sarah and knew her to be one of the most competent and professional sailors on base. As he approached the center of the confrontation, he could see Webb's increasing panic as the reality of his situation became clear. Webb's companion, Lieutenant Junior Grade Foster, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Foster understood military protocol and hierarchy well enough to realize that Webb had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The fact that so many senior enlisted personnel were now standing in silent judgment was unprecedented, and Foster knew that the incident would be discussed and analyzed at the highest levels of command. Webb himself was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake.
The laughter that had seemed so appropriate just minutes earlier now felt hollow and desperate. He looked around the room, seeing faces that reflected disappointment, disgust, and profound disapproval.
These weren't just random personnel who had witnessed an incident. Many of them were people whose opinions mattered, whose recommendations could make or break careers, whose respect was earned through years of exemplary service.
Everybody sit down, Webb said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence.
This is a private matter between myself and Petty Officer Chen. But no one moved. The SEALs remained standing. Their silence more powerful than any words could have been. Their message was clear. They had witnessed something unacceptable, and they would not pretend otherwise by returning to their normal activities as if nothing had happened. Master Chief Hayes finally reached the confrontation. His presence immediately felt by everyone in the area. Hayes carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from 3 decades of faithful service and consistent leadership. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Lieutenant Webb," he said simply, "I think you need to step away from Petty Officer Chen now." Webb turned to face the Master Chief, and for a moment it looked like he might argue or try to justify his actions. But Hayes's expression made it clear that any such attempt would be both futile and potentially career-ending. The Master Chief had clearly seen enough to understand exactly what had occurred, and his intervention was not a request but a command, backed by the full weight of his position and experience. "Master Chief, this sailor was showing disrespect to a commissioned officer," Webb said, his words sounding weak and unconvincing even to himself. Hayes looked at Webb with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for particularly slow students. "Son, I've been watching this situation develop for the past 10 minutes, and what I've seen is a professional sailor conducting herself with dignity while being subjected to verbal and physical abuse by someone who should know better." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Hayes had not raised his voice, had not threatened or intimidated, but his assessment of the situation was delivered with such calm certainty that it felt like a final judgment. Webb's face went through several changes of expression as he processed what the Master Chief had said. The word abuse hit him particularly hard, forcing him to confront the reality of his own actions in a way that his earlier justifications had allowed him to avoid. "I was simply correcting inappropriate behavior," Webb said weakly, but his words lacked conviction. Hayes looked around the mess hall, taking in the dozens of standing personnel, the absolute silence, the palpable tension in the air. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of sadness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "Lieutenant, in 31 years of service, I have never seen a commissioned officer strike an enlisted sailor in a dining facility. I have never seen such a complete failure of leadership, professionalism, and basic human decency." Hayes paused, letting his words sink in. "And I have never been more ashamed to witness the behavior of someone wearing the uniform I have proudly worn for most of my adult life. The condemnation was complete and devastating. Hayes had not just criticized Webb's actions. He had questioned his fundamental fitness to wear the uniform and serve in a position of leadership. Coming from someone of Hayes's experience and reputation, the assessment carried enormous weight. Webb stood there, surrounded by silent witnesses to his failure, facing the professional destruction of everything he had worked to achieve. The laughter that had seemed so appropriate just minutes earlier was now a distant memory, replaced by the growing realization that his military career might be effectively over. Sarah remained at attention throughout the exchange, her bearing perfect despite the circumstances. She had not responded to Webb's abuse with emotion or retaliation, had not compromised her own professionalism despite extreme provocation, and had handled herself with a grace that made Webb's behavior look even worse by comparison. The mess hall remained silent, dozens of personnel standing in solidarity with a colleague who had been wronged, their collective presence serving as a powerful reminder of the values that truly mattered in military service. The moment stretched on, pregnant with implications that would reverberate through the base community for months to come. Webb finally understood that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return, and that his actions would be remembered long after any official investigation was complete. The men and women standing around him were not just witnesses to an incident, they were the living embodiment of the standards and values he had violated, and their silent judgment was more powerful than any formal punishment could ever be. Master Chief Hayes took a step forward, his presence commanding absolute attention in the still silent mess hall. The weight of 31 years of military service, countless deployments, an unwavering dedication to the Navy's core values seemed to emanate from him like gravity itself. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard by every person in uniform within earshot. "Lieutenant Webb, you will step away from Petty Officer Chen immediately. You will then accompany me to my office where we will discuss this incident in detail." Hayes paused, his gaze never wavering from Webb's increasingly pale face. "After that discussion, you will report to the commanding officer first thing tomorrow morning to explain your conduct tonight." Webb's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that might somehow salvage the situation. The reality of his predicament was becoming impossible to ignore. He was surrounded by witnesses to his unprofessional conduct, facing a Master Chief whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for leadership failures, and staring at the very real possibility that his naval career was about to end in disgrace. "Master Chief, I think you're overreacting to what was essentially a minor disciplinary matter," Webb said, his voice cracking slightly with desperation. "Petty Officer Chen was showing disrespect, and I simply corrected her behavior in accordance with good military order and discipline." The response from Hayes was immediate and devastating in its quiet intensity. "Son, in 3 decades of service, I have witnessed good military order and discipline more times than you can count. What I saw here tonight was the antithesis of everything those words represent. You publicly humiliated a dedicated sailor, escalated a minor interaction into a major confrontation, and then committed assault against a subordinate who had shown nothing but professionalism throughout your verbal attack." Hayes took another step closer, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have conveyed. "Worse than that, you laughed about it. You took pleasure in abusing your authority and hurting someone who serves this country with honor and distinction. That, Lieutenant, is not leadership. That is not military bearing. That is the behavior of a bully and a coward." The words hit Webb like physical blows, each one carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much damage they could inflict. Hayes was not just criticizing Webb's actions, he was systematically destroying any possible justification for them while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of leadership that Webb clearly lacked. Around them, the standing SEALs and other personnel remained motionless, their silent presence serving as a jury that had already reached its verdict. Chief Martinez felt a sense of profound satisfaction as he watched Hayes handle the situation with the kind of moral authority that came from years of putting service before self. Senior Chief Williams nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing in Hayes the same commitment to core values that had guided his own career. Sarah continued to stand at attention, but now there was something different in her bearing. The isolation and humiliation she had felt during Webb's attack had been replaced by something else entirely. She was no longer alone in this confrontation. The men and women standing around her were not just witnesses. They were allies. Colleagues who had recognized an injustice and chosen to stand against it through their silent solidarity. Petty Officer First Class Kim felt a surge of anger as he watched Webb squirm under Hayes' moral authority. Kim had deployed with teams that depended on Sarah's expertise, had seen her work through impossible deadlines to ensure mission success, had witnessed her dedication to excellence in ways that Webb could never understand. The idea that someone like Webb would dare to lay hands on someone like Sarah was almost incomprehensible to him. Chief Santos, meanwhile, was thinking about the broader implications of what had occurred. As one of the few senior female personnel on base, she understood that Webb's behavior towards Sarah was part of a larger pattern of disrespect that women in the military faced every day. But she also recognized that the response from the SEALs and other personnel represented something hopeful, a community that would not tolerate such behavior, regardless of rank or gender. Webb made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Master Chief, I outrank Petty Officer Chen, and I have the authority to discipline subordinates as I see fit. This is exactly the kind of interference from enlisted personnel that undermines good order and discipline throughout the Navy. The silence that followed Webb's words was so complete that the hum of the mess hall's ventilation system seemed unnaturally loud. Hayes stared at Webb with an expression that mixed disbelief with profound disappointment, as if he were watching someone destroy their own career through sheer stupidity and arrogance. "Lieutenant," Hayes said finally, his voice carrying a note of sadness that was somehow more devastating than anger, "you have just demonstrated that you fundamentally do not understand the difference between leadership and abuse of power. You do not understand the meaning of military bearing, the importance of treating subordinates with dignity and respect, or the basic human decency that should guide every interaction between service members." Hayes gestured slightly toward the standing SEALs and other personnel surrounding them. "These men and women have seen real leadership in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. They have followed orders that took them into harm's way, because they trusted the judgment and character of their leaders. They understand what it means to serve something larger than themselves, to put mission and shipmates before personal comfort or ego." The Master Chief's voice grew stronger, more forceful, as he continued his assessment of Webb's character and conduct. What they witnessed here tonight was the complete opposite of those values. They saw someone abuse his position to satisfy his own need to feel powerful and important. They saw someone take pleasure in hurting a colleague who has earned their respect through years of faithful service. And they saw someone who, even when confronted with the consequences of his actions, refuses to accept responsibility or show remorse. Webb's face had gone from red to pale during Hayes' speech, and beads of sweat were visible on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the mess hall. He looked around desperately, seeking some face that might show sympathy or support, but found none. Even Lieutenant Foster, his companion and fellow officer, was looking at him with a mixture of disgust and embarrassment. "Master Chief Hayes," came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. "I believe I can provide some additional context for this situation." Everyone turned to see Commander Lisa Rodriguez approaching the confrontation. Rodriguez was the executive officer of the base, second in command and widely respected for her tactical intelligence and unwavering commitment to maintaining the highest standards of conduct among all personnel. Her presence transformed the situation from a disciplinary matter handled at the senior enlisted level to something that would clearly reach the highest levels of command. Commander Rodriguez had been finishing a late meeting with the operations officer when reports of the disturbance in the mess hall had reached her. She had initially planned to let Hayes handle what she assumed was a minor disciplinary issue, but the description of events she had received made it clear that this was something requiring immediate command attention. As Rodriguez approached, Webb instinctively came to attention, his military training overriding his panic, but his bearing was sloppy, his movements uncertain, betraying the stress and alcohol that had contributed to his catastrophic failure in judgment. "Lieutenant Webb," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of command. "Master Chief Hayes has briefed me on the basic facts of this incident. Before we proceed further, I want to make sure I understand exactly what occurred here tonight." Rodriguez turned to address the room at large, her gaze sweeping across the still-standing SEALs and other personnel. "I want every person who witnessed this incident to understand that your observations and testimony may be relevant to official proceedings. If you saw something that you believe command should know about, I expect you to report it through proper channels." The implications of Rodriguez's words were clear to everyone present. This was no longer a simple disciplinary matter that might be resolved with counseling or minor punishment. This was becoming the subject of an official investigation that could result in courts-martial, administrative separation, or other career-ending consequences. Chief Martinez stepped forward slightly, his voice respectful but firm. "Ma'am, I witnessed the entire incident from beginning to end. I would be prepared to provide a detailed statement about what I observed." Senior Chief Williams nodded in agreement. "Commander, I also witnessed the incident and would be prepared to provide testimony about Lieutenant Webb's conduct and Petty Officer Chen's professional response throughout the confrontation." One by one, other SEALs and senior enlisted personnel indicated their willingness to provide official statements about what they had witnessed. The cumulative effect was devastating for Webb, who realized that his version of events would be contradicted by multiple credible witnesses, whose word carried enormous weight within the Naval Special Operations community. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully as she took in the responses from the assembled personnel. She had served long enough to recognize when a situation had crossed the line from misconduct to potential criminal behavior, and everything she was hearing suggested that this incident fell into the latter category. "Petty Officer Chen," Rodriguez said, turning to address Sarah directly, "I need you to report to medical for documentation of any injuries, and then to the base legal office to provide a detailed statement about this incident. You should also be aware that you have the right to request a victim's advocate to assist you through this process." The word victim hit Webb like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that his actions were being viewed not as legitimate exercise of authority, but as assault. He opened his mouth to protest, but Rodriguez continued speaking before he could interrupt.
"Lieutenant Webb, you are confined to quarters pending investigation. You are not to have any contact with Petty Officer Chen or any potential witnesses to this incident. You will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning with your service record, and prepared to provide a detailed explanation of your conduct." Rodriguez paused, her expression making it clear that Webb's naval career hung in the balance. "I should also inform you that I will be recommending to the commanding officer that this matter be referred to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service for investigation of potential criminal charges. You have the right to consult with a military attorney before any further proceedings." The mention of NCIS and criminal charges seemed to be the final blow to Webb's composure. His shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation became clear. What had started as what he perceived as a simple assertion of authority had become a career-ending catastrophe that might result in criminal prosecution and imprisonment. Sarah finally broke her rigid attention posture as Commander Rodriguez addressed her directly. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, her voice steady despite everything she had endured. "I appreciate the command's attention to this matter and will cooperate fully with any investigation." Hayes stepped forward to address the crowd of standing personnel. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your support of Petty Officer Chen and your demonstration of the values that make this command special. You may return to your meals, but please be aware that investigators may need to speak with witnesses in the coming days." Slowly, reluctantly, the SEALs and other personnel began to resume their seats. But the atmosphere in the mess hall had fundamentally changed. Conversations were subdued, and many people continued to glance toward the area where the confrontation had occurred, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed. As Webb was escorted from the mess hall by the Master Chief, his career and reputation in ruins, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues who wanted to express their support and outrage at what had happened to her. Chief Martinez was the first to approach, his usually stoic expression showing genuine concern. "Sarah, I want you to know that what happened here was completely unacceptable, and every person in this room will make sure that the truth comes out in any investigation," Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Senior Chief Williams nodded in agreement. "I've been in the Navy for 20 minutes, 2 years, and I've never seen anything like what that officer did to you. His behavior was disgraceful, and he'll face the consequences for it." Other SEALs and personnel approached with similar messages of support, each one reinforcing that Sarah's professionalism and character were recognized and respected by the people who mattered most. The isolation and humiliation she had felt during Webb's attack were being replaced by a powerful sense of community and solidarity. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was charged with assault under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and Administrative Misconduct. The investigation conducted by NCIS had uncovered a pattern of inappropriate behavior during his time at Coronado, including other incidents of bullying and abuse of authority that had previously gone unreported. The court-martial proceedings were swift and decisive. Webb's defense attorney attempted to argue that the incident was a minor disciplinary action that had been blown out of proportion, but the testimony from the SEALs and other witnesses painted a clear picture of unprovoked assault and abuse of power. Chief Martinez's testimony was particularly damaging to Webb's case. "I have deployed with teams in combat zones where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death," he told the court. "I have seen courage, leadership, and sacrifice under the most extreme circumstances. What I witnessed in that mess hole was the complete opposite of everything I understand about military leadership and service." Senior Chief Williams provided testimony that put Webb's behavior in the broader context of military professionalism. "In 2 decades of service, I have worked with hundreds of officers, from junior lieutenants to flag officers. The best leaders understand that their authority comes not from their rank but from their character and their dedication to their people." Lieutenant Webb demonstrated that he understood neither of these principles. Sarah's own testimony was calm, professional, and devastating in its simplicity.
She described Webb's escalating verbal attacks, his apparent intoxication, and the completely unprovoked nature of the physical assault. Her bearing during the testimony reinforced everything that the SEALs and other witnesses had said about her character and professionalism. The military judge's verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. Webb was sentenced to 6 months confinement, reduction in rank, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dismissal from the naval service. The sentence sent a clear message that assault and abuse of power would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or position. But the real consequences of that night in the mess hall extended far beyond Webb's court-martial and imprisonment. The incident became a case study in military leadership courses, an example of how quickly inappropriate behavior could escalate to criminal conduct and career destruction. More importantly, it became a story about the power of moral courage and collective action. The SEALs and other personnel who stood in silent solidarity with Sarah had demonstrated that the military's stated values were not just words on paper but living principles that would be defended when necessary. Sarah continued her naval service with distinction, eventually earning promotion to Petty Officer First Class and receiving commendations for her continued excellence in logistics coordination. The respect she had earned from the special operations community only grew stronger after the incident, as word spread about how she had handled herself under extreme pressure. 5 years later, now Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, she would often be asked about that night in the mess hall. Her response was always the same. I learned that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, is always worth it. And I learned that the military is filled with good people who will stand up for what's right when it matters most. The incident served as a lasting reminder that leadership is not about the power to dominate others, but about the character to serve something greater than oneself. And it demonstrated that true respect in the military is not demanded because of rank, but earned through integrity, professionalism, and unwavering commitment to the values that define service to country. In the end, Lieutenant Webb's laughter had indeed frozen the mess hall that night. But what emerged from that silence was not fear or submission, but a powerful affirmation of the principles that separate true leaders from those who merely wear the uniform. The lesson learned that night would be remembered and retold for years to come, a testament to the enduring power of moral courage in the face of abuse and injustice.